Communist Party leadership. What it means for our case is that in foreign diplomacy, Xi Jinping will be the number one. He will take command of the diplomacy. And as for the in the last party congress, both in the party and also in the state, in the government report, which in the government People's Congress elected Xi Jinping, it is clear that they are now, the party is shifting its economic focus, either on the economic front and even on the diplomacy front. We have to take note of certain important changes. Of course, we know the economic miracle of China is export driven, right? So when we suffer from that, we also produce goods that compete against Chinese goods, and eventually, we cannot compete because they have cheaper labor, they have more developed infrastructure, we know all that. But the happy news from this recent party congress is that the economic strategy is changing, and this is of concern to us because of the pressures of financial crisis, the imbalance of the world, and also the crisis in the export markets, whether in the US or Europe. China is now changing to a more consumption-driven, less dependent on exports, and they would like to stimulate domestic demand. So that is good, because then we can sell more bananas, for example. So that's good that China is stimulating domestic demand because for its own interest. Because depending on export markets will no longer work. The economic security of China will be affected. It also is a cause of conflict. You heard about trade protectionism, currency conflict. China tried to devalue its currency. So that threat will mean that China can both develop its own economy and also minimize conflicts with other countries, including our country, because we compete on certain low margin products. So that's one important new change going on in China. Of course, they will continue their economic trajectory. They still need. The rapid economic growth of China cannot be separated from the need for energy. And here comes Canada, why Canada is important in the calculation of China's policy. So rapid economic growth will continue. Just to observe about 20,000 people who have entered the labor force, but there's the new emphasis on domestic consumption and less dependence on exports. So that's something we can exploit as a country, as a developing country. Another major focus now to change it, and this is part of trying to stimulate economic domestic demand, internal demand, is the focus on urbanization, which means for the next 10, 20 years, the Chinese still planning to transfer about 300 more million people, 300 million farmers to the countryside, from the countryside to the city. So that's a lot of energy, needs for energy, infrastructure, even the automobile industry will keep booming, all these things. It's part of the trying to stimulate domestic demand. That will be another major source of growth in China. So that we have these two important pillars of the new economic program that they have. So that's Xi Jinping on the economic domestic front. On foreign policy, clearly they have, Xi Jinping is talking increasingly of the Chinese dream. That is his buzzword, China dream. He always talks of China dream now. Now in China, China's dream is the new buzzword. People interpret it in many ways, but essentially Xi Jinping is talking of China dream basically in the same way that there's an American dream. He's basically reflecting the needs of the people for better life, basically better life. but it means actually stronger economy. But on the foreign policy front, it will mean a more assertive policy that will defend Chinese economic interests, not just economic, its overall interest on the world stage. And that means a stronger military as well. That's part of that's why they could keep, the last Congress always maintained the double-digit growth in economic, in national defense budget. So we are talking of a new leadership that's talking about China's dream that is in effect trying to accelerate China's assuming a stronger position on the world stage. That's basically, whether economically they want to have more influence in the world financial institutions and all that. They established the BRICS, not just the G20. The G20 is now becoming impotent in solving global economic problems. They established the BRICS, basically BRICS. You've heard of the BRICS, another alternative economic grouping that groups Brazil, China, Russia, India, and they added South Africa. Even it's a small economy, but just to have the continent to represent as an alternative. So China's economic dream essentially involves China asserting its voices on all fronts, on the global stage. Now, in terms of the Philippines, it means a more assertive diplomacy. What does it mean? Well, we know of the island disputes, and then this island disputes including Vietnam, the Philippines, including Japan. Japan especially is a very sensitive issue for the Chinese because the Japanese, as you know, occupied, invaded Japan and caused a lot of suffering to Chinese people. So the Chinese dream of Xi Jinping will mean actually a more assertive defense of Chinese interests and a more awareness of public opinion, of how the government, the leadership, are perceived by the domestic audience. We'll talk more later about the media, the public role, public opinion. How the leadership is perceived to be defending its interests. In the case of Japan, for example, against Japan on the disputed islands. So the Chinese dream will mean that the leadership will not allow themselves to be perceived in domestic public opinion as too weak in defending Chinese interests. But because with the, as you know, of course, although Marxism is the ideological basis of the Communist Party, with the changes, reforms in going on in China, the young generation no longer think in terms of just ideological, or even not many young people believe in Marxism. I mean, the Communist Party continue to believe in that fundamental theory, the doctrine of Marxism. But it's no longer the unifying. So nationalism has taken over. So defense of national interests, nationalism, how the government, how the leadership is perceived as public, defending China's interests against threats, against hostile forces, is very important basis of legitimacy. The Communist Party is not elected, so it relies on. Marxism is no longer a unifying ideological basis for its legitimacy, right? Because of all the changes and also because even its own economic program itself is no longer the typical Marxist-Leninist model. So it has relied more and more on bread and butter issues, delivering economic growth, superior economic performance that can be seen by the ordinary people, the middle class, professional worker, in terms of that's a very important part of legitimacy. The second important part of legitimacy is how it defends nationalism. Nationalism can be unifying. Everybody loves his own country, right? So that's the Communist Party is paying attention to that, and will become more assertive in convincing the public that it is not selling out its national interest. Here comes the Philippines. The island disputes between China and Philippines can have many dimensions, legal, historical, and all that. Those things can be given to experts to debate. What is more important I think from our point of view, is how do we understand, we know our position, we own those islands, this island belongs to us, it's our national interest to defend this island. But then we're dealing with a country that differ with us, of course, claim these islands as their own as well. So it's important for us to understand the background of their thinking, their diplomatic history, the way they dealt with territorial disputes in the past. They had China is the most vulnerable country on earth as a great power because it's surrounded by 13 important neighbors. And there's the Philippines. It dealt with it has a very rich history of dealing with territorial disputes. You know. The most important and the most contentious, in fact, and almost led to war. Well, even not just India, but with the Russian border. You know that east to west border of Russia. It's the longest border that China had, and they dealt with that. Of course, they finally solved it. Well, it's important to cite the Russian-China border because there's some lesson there. That in the time during the Cold War, when China and the Soviet Union were rivals, they had 1 million troops each. They almost went to war. And you know, of course, in his diplomatic history, that the Russians almost wanted the U.S. to at least not to support, at least not to oppose a surgical attack on China. That's why in the time of Mao, he was digging tunnels deep, preparing against nuclear war, because that was really a real threat. They had these border skirmishes and all that. Even in those days when China was weak militarily, they did that back down. They did not give way to the Russians, to the Soviets on border disputes. But later on, they resolved the territorial disputes, the longest in the world. But that took place after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the socialist Soviet Union already collapsed and Russia. The lesson there is that once Russia, or the former Soviet Union, was no longer presenting itself as a threat, and in fact presenting itself as a friend of China, the Chinese, in foreign policy terminology, no longer viewed the Soviet as revisionists, revising the power, the status quo, no longer trying to unilaterally change the status quo. It's a friendly power. Then the stage was set for eventually resolving. Of course, experts took place, the give and take. There is a thing in the Philippines that the Chinese have never given up territory. They did. They give up some territory, and it's a give and take, compromise. That's the lesson there. So, the lesson here for the Philippines is, from the Chinese point of view, is the Philippines a friend or a foe? That is first of all, the Chinese are masters of the art of strategy. Before they go they don't just deal into territory per se, or oil, all important, that's important, fishing, important. But above all, again, go back to the basic starting point. We are dealing with the Communist Party leading the country with all the threats to its regime legitimacy and regime survival. China's always, the Communist Party is always under siege, so to speak, because it's a Communist Party, it's not elected, it's always conscious about threats. The principal driver of foreign policy of China is, some scholars would put it as vulnerability to threats.